"Come on, Ducky. Come on, Lucky," I called, scattering a handful of cracked corn across the lush green grass of my backyard. My two Indian runner ducks, Ducky and Lucky, waddled towards me with surprising speed, their long necks outstretched, their beaks quacking with enthusiastic anticipation. They were a comical pair, Ducky with his sleek black feathers and upright posture, Lucky with her mottled brown plumage and a perpetually goofy expression. Watching them waddle and quack and chase after errant kernels of corn was, for me, the perfect way to unwind after a long day. It was serene. It was therapeutic. It was about to be interrupted. I heard the gate latch click open, and a shadow fell across my idyllic backyard scene. I turned to see a man standing there, his face a mask of utter horror. He was clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and disgust. He looked like he'd just stumbled into a scene from a Hitchcock movie, only instead of crows, it was ducks. I, William Drake, yes, really, am not your typical suburban homeowner. I enjoy the quiet life, the simple pleasures, the company of, well, my ducks. I'm not a farmer, not a zookeeper, just a guy who appreciates the quirky charm of waterfowl. Ducky and Lucky weren't just pets. They were my companions, my feathered friends, my stress relievers. They were, in short, an essential part of my life. My backyard, in the ironically named Featherstone Farms, was my sanctuary, a place of peace, tranquility, and, well, a fair amount of duck poop. But it was my duck poop. "Mr. Drake?" the man stammered, his voice trembling slightly. "That's me," I said, trying to sound friendly, despite the growing sense of dread. "Can I help you?" "I'm Mr. Squawk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "from the Featherstone Farms Homeowners Association." He took a tentative step back, as if afraid Ducky and Lucky might attack. We've received complaints." "Complaints?" I repeated, feigning surprise. "About what? The quacking? I assure you they're much quieter than most of the dogs in this neighborhood." Mr. Squawk shuddered. It's not just the noise, Mr. Drake," he said, his eyes darting nervously between me and the ducks. "It's the ducks themselves. They're unauthorized pets. They're farm animals. They detract from the community's aesthetic appeal." He looked at my ducks. He took another step back, clearly terrified. "They're Indian runners, Mr. Squawk," I corrected, trying to remain calm. "They're domesticated ducks. They're pets. And they're perfectly harmless." "They're unclean, Mr. Drake," he insisted. "They're unsanitary. They're walking disease vectors." "They have a pond, Mr. Squawk," I said, gesturing towards the small, meticulously maintained pond I'd built for Ducky and Lucky. "They're cleaner than most of the kids in this neighborhood." Mr. Squawk was unmoved. He was a man on a mission to rid Featherstone Farms of all unauthorized waterfowl. He handed me an official-looking notice, his hand shaking slightly, and informed me that I had 2 weeks to remedy the situation or face a fine. He then practically ran from my yard, his clipboard clutched to his chest like a life preserver. I looked at Ducky and Lucky, who were now happily splashing in their pond, oblivious to the bureaucratic storm brewing around them. "Well, guys," I said, sighing, "it looks like we're in trouble." I just knew this came from Penelope. The HOA meeting was, as expected, a masterclass in petty tyranny and bird-related paranoia. It was held in the Featherstone Farms Community Clubhouse, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone with a deep-seated fear of color. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige everything. The board members sat at a long table, looking like a collection of disapproving vultures. and presiding over them all was Penelope. Penelope Plume, the president of the Featherstone Farms HOA, and the undisputed queen of all things orderly and bird-free. She was an older woman, immaculately dressed in a beige, of course, pantsuit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression a permanent mask of disapproval. She radiated an air of control and a deep-seated aversion to anything that flew, feathered, or, God forbid, quacked. Rumor had it she'd had a traumatic childhood experience involving a rogue goose and a picnic basket. I didn't know the details, but the phobia was clearly real. "Mr. Drake," Penelope began, her voice sharp and accusatory, "your ducks have been brought to our attention." She said ducks, as if they were some kind of biohazardous waste. "My ducks, Miss Plume," I corrected, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, "are my pets. They're friendly, they're clean, and they're confined to my property." "They're unsanitary, Mr. Drake," Penelope declared, her voice rising in pitch. "They're noisy, they're attracting other birds, and they're lowering property values." "Lowering property values?" I repeated, incredulous. "They're ducks, Penelope. They're not a meth lab. They're not a toxic waste dump. They're 2 small, relatively quiet ducks." "They're farm animals, Mr. Drake," she insisted. "This is a residential community, not a barnyard." "They're Indian runners, Penelope," I countered. "They're domesticated. They're no different than having a dog or a cat. Except, they lay eggs, and they're much quieter than most of the dogs around here." "They're a menace, Mr. Drake," she continued, ignoring my comments. They're spreading disease. They're attracting predators. They're ruining the aesthetic harmony of Featherstone Farms." I pointed out that there were no rules specifically against ducks in the HOA bylaws. I explained that Ducky and Lucky were well cared for, that their pond was clean, and that they posed no threat to anyone. I even offered to build a higher fence around their enclosure to further contain them, and perhaps to shield them from Penelope's horrified gaze. The other board members, a collection of mostly middle-aged men and women who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few of them, I noticed, were actually smiling at the mention of Ducky and Lucky. Perhaps they were secret duck enthusiasts, yearning to break free from the beige tyranny of Featherstone Farms. But Penelope? She was unmoved. She was a woman on a mission to eradicate all traces of waterfowl from her perfectly ordered and perfectly bird-free community. "The ducks," she declared, slamming her gavel down with unnecessary force, "must go. You have 2 weeks, Mr. Drake, and you are hereby fined $250 for violating the peace and tranquility of Featherstone Farms." Peace and tranquility? It was 2 ducks. I walked out of that meeting, my blood boiling, my sense of injustice reaching critical levels. Penelope Plume had declared war on Ducky and Lucky, and I, William Drake, was not about to surrender. 2 weeks. That's all the time Penelope Plume, in her infinite bird-phobic wisdom, had given me to get rid of Ducky and Lucky, to rehome my beloved Indian runners, to deprive them of their meticulously maintained pond, their carefully curated diet of cracked corn and mealworms, their right to exist in my backyard. 2 weeks to absolutely, positively not comply. I, William Drake, was not a giver-upper of ducks. I was a keeper of ducks, a defender of ducks, a champion of all things feathered and web-footed, and I was not about to let Penelope and her band of HOA busybodies separate me from my beloved companions. It wasn't just about the ducks anymore. It was about principle. It was about freedom. It was about the right to have ducks in your own backyard, even if they did occasionally leave a little present on the patio. They were like my children, My internal monologue was a delightful mix of outrage, determination, and a growing fascination with an increasingly willed idea. "They want to take away my ducks," I muttered to myself, pacing my living room. "Fine, let them try, but they're going to have to deal with the consequences." I needed a plan, a strategy, a way to fight back, to defend my duck's right to exist, to make Penelope Plume's head explode. And to do that, I needed information, and I started researching. HOA regulations, of course, local ordinances regarding pets, livestock, and wildlife. And most importantly, I started researching wildlife sanctuaries, because somewhere in the midst of my righteous indignation, a seed of an idea had been planted. A crazy idea, a glorious idea, a sanctuary-sized idea. I learned they were already working on changing the rules to ban my ducks. The HOA bylaws. My constant companion, my source of both frustration and, increasingly, inspiration. I pored over the document, searching for a weakness, a loophole, a glimmer of hope. I focused on the sections about pets, livestock, and permitted uses of residential property. And then, I found it. It was in the section on animal control. There were restrictions on the number and type of pets allowed. There were rules about livestock, clearly intended to prevent people from turning their suburban backyards into working farms. But, and this was the crucial part, there was a vague exception. A clause that mentioned wildlife sanctuaries or nature preserves, stating that such entities might be permitted, provided they met certain, easily manipulated criteria, such as promoting biodiversity, providing educational opportunities, and enhancing the natural beauty of the community. "Wildlife sanctuaries," I muttered, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Nature preserves." The wording was so wonderfully ambiguous, so open to interpretation. It was a loophole big enough to fly a whole flock of ducks through. Operation Feathered Freedom was born. My plan was simple in its audacity. I wouldn't just fight to keep my ducks. I'd expand their domain. I'd transform my entire property into a legally protected, elaborately designed wildlife sanctuary, specifically for waterfowl. It would be a haven, not just for Ducky and Lucky, but for all ducks and other birds, of course. It would be a place of peace, tranquility, and, a whole lot of quacking. It would be beautifully landscaped, with native plants, water features, and nesting areas. It would be educational, with signage explaining the importance of wetlands and the wonders of avian life. And it would be, most importantly, HOA-proof. I'd argue, with a perfectly straight face, that Ducky and Lucky were no longer pets. They were residents of the sanctuary. They were ambassadors for their species. They were part of a larger, ecologically significant project, and therefore they were exempt from the HOA's petty restrictions on pets and livestock. I might have to change their names to something more official. I could already picture Penelope's reaction. The sputtering outrage, the vein throbbing in her forehead, the inevitable meltdown. It was a beautiful image. I knew it was ridiculous. I knew it was probably going to be expensive, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about ducks anymore. It was about freedom. It was about the right to live in harmony with nature, even in the midst of suburbia. It was mostly about getting back at Penelope Plume. And that, I decided, was a cause worth fighting for. My first step was finding someone to help me bring my vision to life. I needed a landscape architect, a wildlife expert, someone who wouldn't look at me like I'd completely lost my mind when I explained my plan. I found her online. Her name was Sarah, a different Sarah than previous stories, and her company, Wildscapes Design, specialized in creating natural habitats for wildlife in urban and suburban environments. She was, according to her website, a passionate advocate for biodiversity and a certified bird nerd. So, let me get this straight. Sarah said, looking over my rather ambitious sketches for the proposed wildlife sanctuary. You want to turn your entire backyard into a duck sanctuary? Because your HOA doesn't like your pet ducks? Exactly, I said, nodding enthusiastically. Think Wetlands Wonderland. Think Avian Paradise. Think the most elaborate HOA-defying duck habitat ever created. Sarah stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. You're serious? Dead serious, I said. I have a situation with my HOA president, and this is my response. I briefly recounted the saga of the duck decree, the fine Penelope Plume's bird phobia, and my burning desire for a little bit of feathered revenge. Mr. Drake, Sarah said, wiping a tear from her eye, you are my new hero. I'm in. This is going to be amazing. But are you sure about this? It's a bit much. Much is exactly what I'm going for, I said. I want it to be unforgettable. I want it to be unmistakable. I want it to be the most glorious, ridiculous, duck-filled sanctuary the world has ever seen. She also mentioned she was a bird enthusiast and was excited to get started. And so construction began. The first step was, of course, the water feature. My existing duck pond, while perfectly adequate for Ducky and Lucky, was far too small for a sanctuary. We needed something bigger, something grander, something pond-like. We expanded the existing pond, creating a large, irregularly shaped body of water, complete with natural-looking rock borders, a small waterfall for aeration and aesthetic appeal, and plenty of shallow areas for wading and dabbling. We added native plants, reeds, cattails, water lilies, to provide food and shelter for the ducks, and any other feathered friends who might decide to visit. Then came the landscaping. We transformed my formerly ordinary lawn into a miniature ecosystem, planting a variety of native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers to attract birds, butterflies, and other beneficial creatures. We created winding pathways, lined with smooth river stones, leading to different habitats within the sanctuary. We also built several nesting boxes and shelters, specifically designed for different bird species. There were small, cozy boxes for wrens and chickadees, larger platforms for robins and doves, and even a slightly ridiculous duck mansion, a multi-level structure with ramps, nesting areas, and a private swimming pool, a shallow birdbath-like basin, for Ducky and Lucky. And, of course, we installed a subtle yet effective fence around the entire property, not to keep the birds in, but to keep Karen out. It was a beautiful fence, made of natural wood and interwoven with climbing vines, blending seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. It was, in short, the perfect combination of practicality and aesthetics. The construction process was, as expected, a spectacle. Trucks arrived, carrying tons of rocks, soil, plants, and building materials. Workers swarmed over my yard, digging, planting, hammering, and generally creating a cacophony of construction noise. The neighbors, as expected, were intrigued. They gathered on their lawns, watching the transformation with a mixture of shock, amusement, disbelief, and the inevitable question, what on earth is that man doing? I, of course, played the part of the eccentric wildlife enthusiast perfectly. I'd stroll around my yard wearing a safari hat for dramatic effect and offering vague yet enthusiastic explanations. It's a wildlife sanctuary, I'd say, with a perfectly straight face, a haven for birds, a tribute to nature. My internal monologue was a constant stream of triumphant pronouncements and giddy anticipation. "Take that, Penelope Plume," I'd mutter to myself as the pond was expanded, Enjoy your aesthetic appeal now." I imagined her face, contorted with rage, her perfectly coiffed hair, probably, standing on end. It was a beautiful thought. There was, of course, a brief visit from an HOA representative. Not Penelope, thankfully. She was probably still recovering from the shock of seeing the construction trucks arrive. "Mr. Drake," he said, looking nervously at the rapidly expanding pond and the growing collection of birdhouses, his voice a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "We've received some concerns about this project." "Concerns?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "What kind of concerns?" "Well," he said, stammering slightly, "it's rather extensive and unconventional." "It's a wildlife sanctuary," I corrected, with a perfectly straight face. "And, as you can see," I added, pulling out a copy of my permits and the relevant HOA bylaws, both of which I now carried with me at all times, "it's perfectly compliant, all permits approved, all regulations followed, and, I might add, it's already attracting a variety of beautiful birds." I pointed towards a robin perched on one of the newly installed nesting boxes. He looked at the documents, then at the sanctuary, then back at me. He clearly had no idea what to do. He mumbled something about reviewing the situation and retreated, looking utterly defeated. I, William Drake, had once again outmaneuvered the HOA, and my wildlife sanctuary, my feathered fortress of HOA defiance, was nearing completion. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The neighborhood was buzzing, and I, for one, couldn't wait to see the final result. And even more importantly, I couldn't wait to see Penelope's reaction. The completion of my wildlife sanctuary, or Feathered Friends Refuge, as I'd officially, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, named it, was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It stood there in my backyard, a testament to my love for ducks, my defiance of the HOA, and my, perhaps slightly unhinged commitment to a good prank. It was spectacular. It was absurd. It was everything I'd hoped for. And, of course, Penelope Plume arrived within the hour. She didn't even bother with the pretense of knocking. She just stormed onto my property, which technically was now a wildlife sanctuary, her face a mask of outrage, her perfectly pressed pantsuit practically radiating indignation. "What?" she bellowed, her voice echoing through the previously peaceful neighborhood. "Have you done?" I emerged from behind a newly constructed bird-watching blind, a picture of calm serenity, holding a pair of binoculars and wearing a safari hat. For dramatic effect, of course. "Good afternoon, Penelope," I said, my voice smooth and even. "You're admiring my wildlife sanctuary, I presume?" "Wildlife sanctuary?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the expanded pond, the lush landscaping, and the numerous birds, including, of course, Ducky and Lucky, happily paddling and quacking. This is insane! You've turned your backyard into a bird zoo!" "It's a wildlife sanctuary, Penelope," I corrected, with a perfectly straight face. "A haven for waterfowl, a tribute to nature. And, as you can see, it's perfectly compliant with the HOA bylaws. Remember that clause about wildlife sanctuaries and nature preserves? Well, here it is. But, it's full of ducks," she stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ducks are birds, Penelope," I said patiently, "and birds are wildlife. Therefore, this is a wildlife sanctuary. My ducks, Ducky and Lucky," I added, gesturing towards my 2 Indian runners, who were currently preening themselves on the edge of the pond, are simply residents. "Along with," I continued, with a sweeping gesture towards the rest of the yard, "a variety of other feathered friends. Indeed, my sanctuary had already attracted a surprising number of wild birds. Robins, blue jays, cardinals, even a pair of majestic herons had taken up residence in my backyard, drawn by the abundant food, water, and shelter. It was a veritable avian paradise. It's unnatural, she declared. It's unsightly. It's going to attract more birds. That's the point, Penelope, I said with a shrug. It's a wildlife sanctuary. It's supposed to attract birds. And, I might add, it's having a positive impact on the local ecosystem. More birds, more biodiversity, more natural beauty. Ironically, of course. Penelope looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. I'll have this thing removed, she vowed, her voice hoarse. I'll sue you. You'll do nothing, Penelope, I said, my voice firm, because I've followed the rules. And now if you'll excuse me, I have to go feed my ducks. I turned and walked towards the pond, leaving Penelope sputtering in impotent rage on my, now officially designated wildlife sanctuary, lawn. The emergency HOA meeting, Part 2, the duck debacle, was, if possible, even more chaotic than the previous ones. Penelope, looking like she'd aged another 20 years in the past few weeks and was running only on pure spite and bird-induced anxiety, presented her case with the fervor of a deranged dictator. This wildlife refuge, she declared, her voice shaking with emotion, is an affront to everything Featherstone Farm stands for. It's a safety hazard. It's an eyesore. It's going to attract rats. I had no idea where she got that one. She'd even brought in a so-called ornithologist, a guy who looked suspiciously like her dentist, wearing a safari hat that was clearly too small for his head, who testified about the dangers of attracting wild birds to residential areas, citing everything from bird droppings to potential disease outbreaks. Then, it was my turn. I presented it that I complied with the previous rules, and therefore shouldn't be punished. The HOA, of course, had already changed the rules again to include a ban on wildlife sanctuaries. Miss Plume, I began, addressing the board with a calm, reasonable demeanor that was, of course, completely fake, seems to be under the impression that I've somehow violated the HOA bylaws. I assure you, I have not. I presented my defense meticulously and methodically. I cited the previous bylaws, the ones in effect when I'd started my project, highlighting the fact that there were no restrictions on wildlife sanctuaries or nature preserves. I argued that my sanctuary was a protected entity, that it was promoting biodiversity, providing educational opportunities, and enhancing the natural beauty of the community, a claim that was met with a mixture of laughter and groans. I even brought in some of my feathered residents to the meeting. Ducky and Lucky, waddling proudly at my side, and a borrowed, rehabilitated barn owl named Hoot, perched calmly on my arm. Hoot, thankfully, behaved himself, although he did give Penelope a rather unnerving stare. The other board members were, to put it mildly, divided. Some were clearly still loyal to Penelope, but their support was rapidly disintegrating. Others looked confused, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation, and a few, I suspected, were secretly admiring my ingenuity and my adorable ducks. Then, a woman from the back of the room stood up. She was a local wildlife biologist, a resident of Featherstone Farms I'd met during the sanctuary's construction. "I have to disagree with Miss Plume," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I think Mr. Drake's wildlife sanctuary is remarkable. It's a beautifully designed, well-maintained habitat that's providing a valuable service to the local ecosystem. It's attracting a variety of bird species, increasing biodiversity, and creating a unique educational opportunity for the community. And frankly," she added with a smile. "It's a lot more interesting than another beige lawn." That was the final blow. The board, facing a potential lawsuit, a public relations nightmare, and the undeniable evidence of my sanctuary's positive impact, and the undeniable cuteness of Ducky and Lucky, voted to do nothing. The meeting ended in chaos, with Penelope screaming about the end of civilization as we know it, and the rise of the feathered menace, and me, William Drake, the accidental wildlife warrior, walking out with a smug, but well-deserved, I thought, smile on my face. But Penelope, like a particularly persistent and bird-phobic Terminator, wasn't about to give up. What followed was a period of escalating absurdity that I can only describe as the Sanctuary War. Penelope, obsessed with getting rid of my wildlife sanctuary, or, at the very least, making my life miserable, tried every tactic she could think of. She filed complaints with the city, claiming it was a zoning violation, a health hazard, and a public nuisance. The city inspectors came, they inspected, and they found nothing. My sanctuary was perfectly legal. She tried to organize a neighborhood petition to have it removed. She went door to door, armed with her clipboard and her think of the property values speech, trying to convince people that my sanctuary was a threat to their peaceful, bird-free existence. The petition failed miserably. Most people either politely declined to sign or slammed the door in her face. Some even joined my Feathered Friends fan club, a group I'd created, mostly for fun, to promote the sanctuary and share information about local bird life. She even, I suspect, attempted some minor acts of sabotage. I found a few, easily removed, Keep Featherstone Farms bird-free signs stuck in the ground near the pond, and one morning I woke up to find the sanctuary mysteriously covered in birdseed. Apparently she was hoping to attract a massive flock of pigeons to, I don't know, poop on everything. Her logic was, as always, questionable. Of course, I had security cameras everywhere, capturing her every move. And I, of course, responded in kind. Not with vandalism, oh no, I was above that. I responded with enhancements. I added a bird-watching blind to the sanctuary, a small enclosed structure with comfortable seating and viewing windows, perfect for observing the avian residents in their natural habitat. I installed educational signage throughout the sanctuary, providing information about the different bird species, their habitats, and their importance to the ecosystem. I even created a waterfowl feeding station stocked with high-quality, HOA-approved birdseed, just to rub it in. And because why not, I hosted a Feathered Friends Festival at my sanctuary. I invited all the neighbors, except Penelope, naturally, put up decorations, bird feeders, bird houses, and even a few fake flamingos just for old times' sake, and served refreshments, including duck-shaped cookies and birdseed trail mix. The local news showed up, filming a segment about the ongoing feud between a homeowner and his HOA, and the wildlife sanctuary that's taking the neighborhood by storm. I even started charging admission. It was a glorious, ridiculous, utterly over-the-top spectacle. And with each passing day, with each new addition, with each new act of defiance, I could feel Penelope's frustration growing, her power waning, her sanity slipping. The wildlife sanctuary had become more than just a place for ducks. It was a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of creative and slightly unhinged rebellion.